So I'm pleased to introduce members of the working committees. So at last year's summit, we formed a number of working committees and determined a number of action items and so on. And over the course of the year, these lovely groups have been working away and doing some wonderful things, which they will now be sharing with us. So I'm going to introduce or welcome them to the stage. They will be introducing themselves and telling us more about what the working committees have been doing over the last year, and also it will be helpful as we start planning for the next year as well to make sure that we're mobilizing and organizing around the work that's already been done. So without further ado, working committees, take it away.
Merci, Sophie. Good morning, everyone. I'm Martine Elias, and I'm going to sing that quite a bit, but today and tomorrow, as you'll see a lot of me as one of the patient reporter. So I had the pleasure to work with Alan, who's going to share the presentation update on the public payer working group with me. But before we start, what questions that we asked ourselves is how do we influence or how can we change the minds of private payers or public payers, when it comes to drug reimbursement, and what are the things that are really important for them? What are resonating? What are kind of the themes that we're hearing a lot of them saying these days? And real world evidence came up loud and clear. There was something that payers wanted to look at to address sustainability of their drug plans, and because they're hit once the drug are approved and they're funded with what does that mean and how does that translate in the real world. So that's why we decided to focus on real world evidence and how drugs should be reimbursed into that context. And I think it goes back to the presentations that we had earlier when we talked about value-based treatment pathways, where I think real world evidence can play a huge role. So where to focus, where to start? I mean, obviously everybody has a very different definition of what real world evidence is. So we brought two experts to our committee to discuss and give us their thoughts on what real-world evidence means. We invited Dr. Andy Sadaf and Manjor Lalu to discuss and present their views. And one is an oncologist, and the other doctor is a researcher in health outcomes and has a lot of experience in real-world evidence. So, I talked a lot about this, but really what I want to point out is, the definition and how is it being used, because the world I came from, real world evidence was used in a very specific sort of set of circumstances. And, one of the questions that one can ask around how do you collect and how do you measure real world evidence is what are the opportunities? Because, we can collect and measure a whole bunch of stuff, but if we don't use it properly, if we don't ask the questions in the right way, then we're going to go down, a rabbit hole that we don't want to go into. So, we looked at the definitions of real-world evidence from a number of organizations, and we've listed them here. We looked at definitions from Europe, from the U.S., from our own backyard here in Canada, from healthcare or Health Economics Association, and also CADIS, which was quite interesting because they don't really have a real-world evidence definition. It's listed under their projects in development. So where we landed, or where we thought that the definition of real-world evidence made more sense to us, is the one that is provided by the Canadian Institute of Health Research, or CIHR, because they really focus on the patients. The only one definition that talked about or had the mention of patients, which to us was kind of like a no-brainer. Patients should be included. So what is real-world evidence? Well, it's the data that you can collect outside of a clinical trial. So that can be extremely, extremely broad. But how do you measure it? How do you get to it? What questions do you ask to get to the real-world evidence are also very important. So But before we can get to the evidence, which is what the data tells us, there's another sort of big buzzword that we hear a lot these days, and it's real-world data. So the data is what you collect as a patient, and you can collect it through a whole bunch of different ways. You can have it, wearable, Fitbits, phone. You can put in information. I feel really, happy faces and sad faces on a daily basis. It's related to your electronic medical record. In clinical trials, you collect, especially in oncology, grade 1 to 4 side effects, grade 4 extremely, debilitating for patients. But when you go to your general practitioner or your oncologist, hematologist, they don't ask you, have you had a grade 4 side effect? They ask you how you feel. So those are the kinds of, real world evidence or endpoints that are being used to collect and that can form decisions or recommendations around what does the evidence tell you. So we really wanted to have a good understanding of what the different elements were, so then when we go back and move to our committee for next year, Alan will talk to you a little bit about that. So that's why we wanted to look at what it meant. So, from the patient's perspective, what does real-world evidence mean? Well, it's not an avalanche of data, but really what it means is what it is like to live with the disease. So, are you able to go back to work and to be productive in society? Are you able to take your medication and not suffer tremendous, side effects? Are you able to live and enjoy life, spend time with your family and friends? Are you able to be productive? Those are the things that really matter to patients. And going back to our discussions earlier, how do we measure this to make this matter? So I'm going to turn it over to Alan, who's going to talk about how we can use it.
Thank you. My name is Alan. So I volunteer for HAP-CPC, but I also work for Arthritis Society. So earlier today we talked about value, and what exactly does that mean for the patients? And here are some of the examples where if we include data on patient-centric and experiences and inputs, here are some of the uses and benefits that would contribute to or support stakeholders across different decision levels, including policy decision makers, evidence assessment agencies, patients, healthcare providers, and public and private payers. This summit actually presents unique opportunities where different stakeholders can work together, as we discussed earlier today, where stakeholders can come together to collaborate, engage, and build capacity for the collection, usage, and monitoring of real-world evidence. One of the key opportunities that we identified is at the HTA levels, where HTA agencies can align policies on real-world data and the evidence and provide guideline and practical aspect on the RWD collection as well as the evidence analysis, especially incorporating that patient voice and experience. Healthcare system ultimately impacts patients. When we're able to collect our real-world data that actually includes patient real-life experiences, the data contributes to the real-world evidence analysis and positive health outcome. And some of the examples that for our RWE program, where patient voice is important, would include a disease registry that would link patient symptoms to treatment outcomes and quality of life. Another example would be safety outcomes over long-term usage of a medication. As technology advances, policy decisions to approve and or to reimburse a drug over the lifespan or the product life cycle should not be primarily based on treatment outcomes, but also on the patient's journey throughout the continuum of care. There will be challenges to incorporate patient voice, the value, into the real-world evidence, and will require persistent stakeholder engagement to overcome those challenges. But we need to find ways to bridge the disconnects between what patients value and the care that patients actually receive. So the public payer group is putting forward this question: how does real-world evidence support a movement towards outcome-oriented healthcare system, a system that is truly patient-centric? And the public payer group is proposing that instead of all working groups working, or in every individual working on different issues, that we work toward a common goal, or come up with a common goal by the end of the summit. And following the summit, we come up with the activities to address those summit, so that we can be able to achieve things together. And finally, just to give you an update on what we've been doing, the members of the public payer group contribute to a few submissions, including PMPRB's proposed amendment on patented medicine regulations, CADID proposed revision on CDRs, P-coder and biosimilar recommendation process, Health Canada proposed prescription drug transparencies. And one of the major points that was included in the discussion was the patient value and adequate access to necessary medication that patient needs. As Canadian governments have expressed the value of patient-centered care in health policies, we need to look at how real-world evidence can be linked to health outcomes and how they can be used in the right context. A lot of the information was mentioned earlier today in the panel discussion, so that's work toward what value to us the most. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carol Reese. I'm with the Canadian Arthritis Patient Alliance. I've been involved with the private payers working group for about 3-4 months now, with Louise, and we're a small and mighty group as well. So what we were looking at is different trends, and what we noticed is the increasing cost of cost containment with some companies, reliance on CADID reviews before undertaking internal reviews, what this means is delaying the process for up to 1.5 years for covering certain biosimilars or any other types of medication. We also met with a benefits consultant to understand their role and to see if there were any opportunities to influence private payers. Some of the issues that arose from this or that we understood were insurance companies, customers are brokers, consultants, and plan sponsors, employees, and not the patient. And until a problem hits the bottom line, there will be no action. So what was the opportunity that we could see with this is, can we influence brokers, consultants, and plan sponsors and employers? So the issue here is, can we motivate customers and primarily brokers, consultants, like this consultant we met, and plan sponsors to better known as employers. They are those who drive the majority of their business until there are negative impacts on profit. Then a proactive action is unlikely. So 2 tactics that we came up with, education and human rights. The opportunity is to influence brokers, consultants, and employers in order to influence insurance companies. We identified a number of means to do this through education and networking. The other opportunity is to explore whether or not any of the mechanisms being used by insurers to delay or deny coverage results in a human rights violation. For education, we identified 3 national bodies that offer educational opportunities to insurance benefits consultants, employers, particularly staff from employers who are responsible for employees' insurance coverage. We can submit to present at these forums to educate and build relationships with these important players in the private insurance ecosystem. The more educated they are, the better questions they can ask when determining the best plan options. And we've also been exploring possible tactics in regards to human rights violation for private payers. And whether or not is it feasible to have a more direct influence on health insurance companies that are using certain mechanisms to delay or deny coverage? And again, is there a human rights violation at play? So the question for all of you is, if we had a survey that could help us better understand the idea of the extent of the impact of the problems caused by different company practices, would you be willing to share that with each of your group's organizations? And do you think this would be a good idea?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Joanne Bertrand, and I'm with the Ontario Caregiver Coalition. And I attended the forum last year and was quite interested and did volunteer a little bit reluctantly because I don't have a lot of free time and try to, in addition to my part-time work for the coalition, spend some time with my grandchildren now that I'm retired. But it did interest me very much because over my professional career, I've worked with the Alzheimer's Society as well as the Schizophrenia Society in Nova Scotia, the Alzheimer's Society in Ontario, and in each case have been very much in touch with the issues of caregivers. And what's emerging, certainly in the last decade, and I'm sure it was in place before, but it's been expressed more, is the level of financial distress for many caregivers. So what interested me about the summit last year was obviously in the healthcare system, drug pricing and drug prices and access to pharmaceuticals are key for many families. And there's a great variation in what is available to people. For example, many people don't work for companies that have benefit plans. Some people are paying out of pocket for medications and can't really afford them. But I also, having had a background in philosophy, understand that you really need to understand the perspective of all individuals involved in a system. And so, again, because of my career, I was very much in touch with people in the pharmaceutical industry who have been very supportive and interested in educating patients. And so I felt I needed to understand a bit more of the system aspect. And I can tell you, even though I've been in the healthcare-related system for many years, there's so many things I don't understand and so many acronyms I can't understand or wasn't familiar with. So I know for the general public, that is an issue. And so I thought working together with people who are in the pharmaceutical industry, who understand the issues from their perspective, was very important, and that's what drew me to this particular working group. Next slide. There we go. So many people in the general public get their information via the media, and certainly in my age category, that's television. In fact, I was just watching Zoomer this morning, and there was a program on pharmaceuticals and pharmacare possibilities in Ontario. But we get conflicting information. And for example, many of you have probably followed American politics and the discussion of healthcare there. And one of those quotes is from Bernie Sanders' representative, who says in promoting his healthcare for everyone policy, why are Canada's prescription drugs so much cheaper than ours in the US? And on the other hand, a quote recently from a Minister of Health of a Canadian province, Canada has the highest drug prices in the world. So again, for the ordinary person, what do you believe, or what do you take from those quotes or that level of information, other than what you find out you have access to yourself? So in our working group, we wanted to put forward these two questions. Today we wanted to ask two fundamental questions related to drug pricing policy and the pharmaceutical industry. We would welcome having these questions answered at a high level over the course of the summit in the next 2 days. And if that is not possible, we would also welcome an opportunity to learn more after the summit. And if there is an observer from the industry here today who is able to help us, we'd really welcome someone from the pharmaceutical industry to join our working group. We don't have anyone at the moment, and that would help us a great deal in moving forward. So you could certainly connect with either me or Leah Stevenson at any time during the summit over the next 2 days. So the questions that we have are, how are the sticker prices set by the pharmaceutical industry in Canada? And the second question, how do manufacturers decide which clinical trials will take place in Canada? And clinical trials are often an opportunity for people to have access to a medication, particularly for a very serious condition where there isn't currently a medication that is helpful. But it's difficult to understand, again, from a layperson's perspective, knowing where you can get access to information about clinical trials, how that is decided, where they take place, because we know they take place all over the world, and drugs are approved at different times and in different ways in different countries. And so again, it would be helpful to know how the pharmaceutical industry makes a decision about that. And we'd love to learn more about answers to these questions and hope to identify partners who can help us. So thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Wendy Gerhardt, and I'm with the Canadian Spondylitis Association. Relatively new to this working group, so bear with me as I try to work through the slides. The focus of the working group is essentially to come together and build our collective capacity as it relates to being engaged in drug pricing and policy work. And so we decided as a group that in order to do this, we should find out directly from all of you. So we decided that we should find out from all of you what your needs are, and so we decided to do a survey to scan your needs. And when we were developing the survey, we realized that the original language that the group developed for the mandate was quite broad, and so we didn't feel that we could both build capacity to do systemic policy change work and be more actively engaged in individual healthcare decisions. So we focused on the former. So the survey we designed was very short, 10 questions, being cognizant of everybody's time and hoping that doing a small survey would attract more people to complete it. We sent the survey to over 100 organizations from across Canada, and we received 36 respondents as of November 3rd. The survey is still open, and if you weren't able to participate in it, please see Leah Stevenson, and she will provide you with a link, because we would love to hear from you as well. Leah's over there. We are going to close the survey, though, at the end of the month. Oops. So, am I on the right survey? Sorry. So one of the questions we asked was, how would you rate your organization's understanding of drug pricing policy issues in Canada? The majority of organizations self-rated themselves of having poor or fair understanding of the issues. The small patient groups, most of the people who answered fair or poor were smaller patient groups, volunteer run. One of them was newly formed within the past year. A couple other comments were that they had very few drugs available to date for their patient populations. The organizations that self-rated as having very good understanding have resources to support hiring staff with significant experience in these areas. And so there were only a couple of those. We asked, how would you rate your organization's understanding of drug pricing in your province versus in Canada from the previous slide? Less patient organizations self-rated themselves as poor, so they have a better understanding of what's going on in their provinces. The same number self-rated as very good. Two self-rated as fair rather than good. And the organizations that self-rated as poor and very good remained the same as in the previous section. When asked what do organizations need to better, to understand better in order to advocate for changes, I don't think there's anything that jumps out on the slide that is not what we would expect to see. You know, they want to see basically, learn more about all the players in the treatment access and pricing policy ecosystem. And so, again, I won't go through all of them, but I don't think there's any surprises there. And also, continuing, these are the top-rated answers. When we asked about what types of tools and resources organizations currently have, most respondents don't have policy information or tools to share. Those that said they do have materials were the more well-established, well-resourced organizations. And even then, no one had comprehensive capacity-building resources. And those five that you see there that said yes, that they do have resources, what they identified were consultation submissions or policy documents, and last year's drug pricing policy summit materials. So I think pretty obvious there's a lot of work to be done. When asked what groups rely on, most say that it's events like this, pharmaceutical partners or other patient organizations or coalitions is how they rely on getting their information. And when asked, what are your organization's preferred means to receive information, the majority was written or online. When we asked how would you like to receive more information, it was a resounding 100% yes, so I think that's a given. And here are our questions for you. Some of you may have the answers already. Once we get to the portions of the summit where we do the planning and prioritizing for this year, we would like to have these questions addressed as well. Where do we need capacity? Where do we need to build capacity now? And how can we best do that together? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Unfortunately, Martina came down with the bug that's going around, and we have a very small working group that everybody else who's on it is currently occupied with other activities here at the summit, so I'm going to do this very brief update. And just special thanks, though, to everyone on this working group and to Martina, who is its chairperson. My name is Leah Stevenson. I am the backbone support for the 5 different working groups, and I was brought on to do that role probably around the spring. Unfortunately, I missed last year's summit, so I'm really excited to be here and to be part of the conversations that will drive our focus going forward. So briefly, the mandate that was set for the communications working group at the last summit in the action plan was to communications with the public. And a few of the activities that kept us busy over the last few months include media engagement, particularly releases that were issued at the end of, so post-summit last year. There was a release that went out sort of announcing that these working groups have been established and positioning them as thought leaders in the area of drug pricing policy from patient perspectives. Media releases and engagement around the CADTH Symposium this year, and of the announcement made in May 2017 by former Minister Philpott at the Economic Club. As well, preparing for this summit, we did a media advisory. Louise is currently, and Andre are currently doing an interview at the moment. We prepared some social media work, which I hope you're all tweeting and taking photos and the rest of it. And we have a Twitter feed. On lunch, you'll see your tweets and what people are saying, and so please feel free to retweet and share. And then after the summit is done, we will issue a release with the key outcomes that are collaboratively decided upon by the patient organizations here today. And we will also look at potentially submitting abstracts, again, in terms of getting greater synergy across all the different working groups. What would be, what's our overarching goal, and so how do we want to position, and how can we support, for example, the private payers working group who've identified, 3 conferences with a very particular audience where we might want to have some particular sway. So bringing all of these tactics together under a larger strategy. And that is all. So I want to thank everyone on all the working groups for all the efforts that they've been making, and today's spokespeople specifically. And I'll just lay up the last 2 slides, which are just a summary of the questions that each working group just asked. And so if you have some thoughts on these right now during the Q&A session, would really welcome that, as well as any other comments or questions you may have for the working groups. But also some of these questions may be better answered as the 2 days progress and we go deeper in the small group work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Oh, yes, go.
Behalf of the working groups for all the work that you did to keep us on task and focused. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's wonderful to hear these updates, and congrats on all the great work. We'll open it up. We will take a bit of time for about 10 minutes for Q&A or comments. So if there are any, please don't hesitate.
If not, I'll have a comment.
Yes, please.
And I just have a comment about, for example, when we did the PMPRB submission, there were 18 organizations that came together to write that up and were to provide feedback. So it does show that this kind of summit can bring people together. So when we talk about collaboration and working together, this would be a great example.
Thank you. Linda, I think you had a comment?
I wasn't at last year's summit, and I'm just going to give a thought that from a patient that's been doing this for a long time, and maybe others out there are thinking the same thing, and obviously we need to change that thinking, but I've always kind of said we can, as patients, drug pricing is so much out of our control. We've never been at those meeting dialogues that go on at Health Canada. We don't really have a lot of sway with any of the health technology bodies. And just, from my perspective, I guess I always put the pricing issue kind of at the bottom of the list, because there were so many other priorities that, as patient groups with few resources, that we work on. So I know there's probably others out there that maybe have thought the same thing, and to me, I'm looking at the summit to see how we can get a voice in this dialogue, and maybe this is a dialogue where we can start to change to the outcomes that we need to see, rather than just keep on going the way we've been going.
probably could have yelled. Brent Baker with the Canadian Pituitary Patient Network. And I just wonder if you could elaborate a bit on the third question that's up on the board right now. Would we be willing to circulate a survey to our members asking them those two questions? And I just wonder if you could elaborate as to the maybe the value of the outcomes for that. What is it? What is your hope to? What's the purpose behind it?
Thanks for your question. I think the outcome of that is really just to make sure that we are putting together appropriate tools that people are looking for, and that we have a clear understanding of what is currently available. And as you found out from the survey, is there's not much, so it gives us a starting point and where people are looking to get their information about.
Sorry, just to clarify, that one's actually a new survey that's being proposed by the private payers group.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Just to clarify, I think, and just jump in, Carol, we know that there's certain companies who have put certain mechanisms into place, and there's not necessarily a lot of awareness by plan sponsors, et cetera, that even exists and that is impacting potentially their employees should they actually need to use their insurance. So having just a sense of who has insurance and with what companies will give us a better sense of the scope of the problems that people may not even know are happening with their plans. So it would be, I think, a pretty straightforward, two-question sort of survey, and it's to get a sense of the scope and the impact of these different mechanisms that have been put into place by different companies on patients.
Good morning, John Ancleta from McKesson Canada. I seem to have a frog in my throat. Regarding that statement in terms of getting that information, have the patient groups thought about working with manufactured sponsored patient support programs who essentially document challenges for reimbursement and consider on how to work with those groups and manufacturers to gather the information you're looking for to then work with you on that? It's just something that, to think about.
Thanks, good suggestion.
Thank you.
Is that? No.
Excuse me. Dan Clow. I'm with GlaxoSmithKline. And I worked for many years with our company on the private sector side, the private insurance side. And the one thing that and it goes along with this, I think the strength for the patient groups is, honestly, I think we need to change the dialogue. We talk about Manulife, Sun Life, Great West, whatever, being the private payers. They're not the private payers. They're the intermediary that makes some money through that process. The private payer is the plan sponsor, the employer, the patient, the union. I mean, they're the ones who make the decision as to what they want to pay. And I think your survey, I don't know if it will get down to that, but I think part of the tactic or the approach that should come after that is employers don't. I mean, they don't know. We're in the drug business, and we don't make decisions based on that kind of knowledge. We make decisions, doesn't matter whether we sell grapple grommets or drugs. We make the same decision based on whatever our advisor comes and tells us. You're going to save $1 here, you're going to save $1 there. But the reality is, health is a strategic focus for a lot of employers. The health of their employees, 75% of their costs are based on their employees. And yet, they really don't understand what's happening. So I do think that part of this approach, part of the tactic needs to be the voice of the patient, many of whom are employees or union members, speaking up and saying, we're not aware of what's happening to us. It's being done to us. So I just would challenge the language of private payer not being the insurers.
Thank you very much.
Can I just respond to that?
Sure, of course.
That is something that we have discussed. We're trying to find forums where we can take part in. And when we spoke with the benefit specialist, quite often, when plans are being developed by an employer to see which one will best meet the needs of their employees, there's not a lot of dialogue between the employer and the employees. So we see that there is a gap there. And I know for myself, I'm lucky enough to have private insurance. However, when I said like, oh, it's comprehensive health care, but the kicker there is not everything is covered. So I think, you know, the education piece needs to be there. It's like, who's going to do it? So we see the gap.
I just want to build on Carol's comment. Thank you so much. In that same conversation, we also talked about what you're suggesting. Is it feasible, you know, for employees themselves to be able to try to be part of this influence for change? But we also talked about the power dynamics and the current, you know, employment situation, and it can be challenging to rely specifically on employees, you know, to do that type of advocacy within their organizations, with, you know, the chains of command and the way things work within organizations. So it's why we started to focus more on how can we influence the staff within organizations who are making the decisions, right? The payers at that level, and the consultants and benefits who are the recommending and advising, et cetera, at that level, instead of necessarily at the employee level. I mean, where that's feasible, great, but in a lot of organizations, or, you know, for a lot of individuals, that may not be something that feels like something they can do safely and keep their job, et cetera. And just one, last comment on Linda's, just as part of the thinking as we're working in small groups and how do we work together, that distinction between control and influence, right? So it's true, there's so little that, as Alan said, patients are ultimately the people who are the most impacted by all of this, and their caregivers, or people who haven't become patients yet but are just trying to stay with their family doc and remain well. And yet, you know, and there's so little control in all of this complexity, and so little, you know, and there's been growth in engagement of patients, but it still largely is tokenistic. So how do we organize ourselves so that we are able to have greater influence across stakeholder groups? And there is this concept out there called collective impact, which basically says, and it does build on what was coming out of this morning, we need to work across stakeholder groups over time in a way that's building trust and safety, so that we can start to make the adjustments and share the risk and et cetera, and come to some common understandings across different perspectives. So is that a way to start having more influence?
Thank you. We have 3 more comments, and okay. So.
Hi again. Sorry. My name is Janet. I'm a patient partner in arthritis, and for the last 9 years, we've been privileged to actually go to the different hospitals where the future doctors, nurses, physiotherapists will, you know, in 5 years' time be practicing. So we're trying to influence the whole process of who will be the future healthcare providers at the student level. So that's why I'm a firm believer in education. I keep hearing that, yes, the power is in the hands of the patient. How many of us have been totally scared, powerless, and in a very precarious situation? You're not going to fight with your doctors and say, well, you need to listen to me, doctor. Like, that's not going to happen, number one. And we're educated. We all speak English. A lot of people in Canada don't speak English or French. So there's a whole lot of vulnerable population. People with mental illness are faster sent to jail than actually being provided the proper treatments. We know that. Look around the room and see how many marginalized or different identities that we see here. LGBTQ, trans people, black people, indigenous people, they are not part of this conversation, which I think is awesome, because I'm learning so much, and I hope all of us are. So we need to bring those issues as well. I was absolutely thrilled to see that one of the strategies, although there was not much elaboration on it, was the human rights. Will denying or delaying treatment could constitute a human rights violation? That would be a very good, interesting question to pose in ARCH, which is the legal healthcare clinic for people with disabilities. I'm sure they will be thrilled to hear about that. But we keep forgetting that Ontario, and I believe a couple other provinces, we have legislation on accessibility. So we need to leverage everything, every step of things that we already have, and, you know, built upon, not just rely on the medical model of healthcare. 50% of the reasons why people get sick is poverty. This is the studies done here in Ontario. So we need to address that as well, the social part of disability. So anyway, awesome work. Congratulations, you all.
Just three quick comments. Mood Disorders Canada, along with a number of other collaborators, has worked with the Conference Board of Canada, quite a significant influencer, on documentation called Healthy Brains at Work. It's available on our website and also on Conference Board's website. The point I'm making is that during those discussions, significant amount of effort was put into looking at EAPs, how they were negotiated, who negotiates for how long, contract, patient input or employee inputs are insignificant, but they can be improved with some effort by talking basically to the employer. But you might find that worthwhile to look at, mostly to build on your own efforts. We've just, pardon me? EAP, Employment Assistance Programs. But it's called Healthy Brains at Work. I just got an email in today saying that we have a new media release coming out in the next couple of weeks. The second thing is that Mood Disorders Canada and a number of other mental health organizations have been asked over the years, what basic questions we're talking about here. What about what aspects of medication can you tell us? We don't know anything, our doctors don't tell us anything. So we're publishing a document called Medications in You. It's reasonably comprehensive, but hopefully written for the public and for our patient community. But it does have a lot of information on it. It'll be on our website in the next couple of weeks. So when it comes up, you're more than welcome to take a look at it. And the third thing is that we have a new collaboration in the last 6 months focused on influencing the Government of Canada and anybody else who will listen to making medications for people with mental illnesses more available. CADTH hasn't approved any medications in the last 12 years for people with mental illnesses, particularly depression. So private payers to us are the only ones who will pay for those medications. Otherwise, if you're not covered by some form of EAP, you're stuck out in the cold. We have a website, ceadm.ca, that you can have a look at and see what we're doing. But there's a lot of stuff going on that you can work with and build on. So thanks very much. Oh, and the other thing is caregivers, we're working with CARP. CARP is a terrific organization. It's not a health organization, but it's really, the advocacy they undertake is terrific. And working with them can only advance what you're doing.
Great. Thank you, Phil, for those great additional resources. And we'll take one last question or comment.
Thank you very much. The comment that came from over here actually just triggered a question for me, and it may be totally naive, but I just wonder if anyone knows if there's any place in the world where insurance companies are doing actuarial analysis that might move them to a values-based outcome model for insurance. I mean, it's a fascinating idea to have even raised. I don't know if, put that in a hopper somewhere.
Yeah, we'll definitely hang on to that one and see if we can get it answered over the course of the summit, or perhaps ask our panelists from this morning as well. So wonderful. With that, I want to thank again all the members of the working committees and the people who presented today on their behalf. Thank you so very much. Thank you as well to Leah for doing the coordination work. Thank you very much. It's been great, and we'll continue the discussion and continue the work planning and so on over the next day and a half. Now we have arrived at lunchtime, so we'll be breaking until 1 o'clock.